Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. Title of the webinar today is Addressing the Challenges of Keeping HR Policies Compliant. For those who don't know me, my name is Henry Umney. I'm the Managing Director of GRC Strategy at Mitratech. Mitratech is a US-based technology company. We work in the legal, HR, and GRC compliance space. Today, we're going to be talking about that intersection between HR and GRC, and specifically around policies and policy management. I'm very glad and pleased and privileged to be joined by Michael Johnson, CEO of Clear Law Institute. Michael, maybe you could introduce yourself and give a little background to yourself and Clear Law.
Yeah, thanks, Henry. Yeah, so for my background, I'm a former attorney in the U.S. Department of Justice, where I used to investigate and litigate cases against employers around the country. And as you can imagine, in those cases, oftentimes, not only the training that employers provided, but their policies or lack of policies were major issues. So as the CEO of Clear Law Institute, we provide online compliance training for thousands of employers around the country, dozens of Fortune 500 companies. And for today's purposes, we also provide a service where we keep employers' HR policies and their employee handbook up to date with any changes in federal or state laws.
Fantastic. Listen, thank you, Michael. The agenda for today is three parts, and we do have the opportunity to ask questions. So please do feel free to put any questions into the Q&A function within Zoom. But really what we're trying to start is, as Michael said, to start looking at the policies, HR policy required at a federal and state level, and then really starting to drill down on the changes that have occurred in state laws, changes in laws at a state level that require some of the changes to those policies that we have within our organizations. Now, as we're going to discuss today, and as Michael's going to highlight, there's quite a lot that organizations need to get their hands around. We've also had, obviously, recent events in terms of COVID that have made seismic changes to the way that we work. The hybrid work from home 2-3 years ago, these were words that we didn't really talk that much about, now is the norm. And that has a huge impact on the way we as organizations work. And it puts a lot of a strain on the organization to be able to keep up to date. And really, that's where the third part of this presentation webinar comes in, is really at the appropriate time, how firms can leverage technology to ensure that we know whether we're up to date. Do we know whether we've updated our HR policy for our employees in Chicago? Do we know whether all of our employees that work from home have attested to the relevant policies to make sure that we are up to date as organizations? So really, the idea of today is to highlight some of the issues. Michael's going to kindly actually walk us through some very specific examples that may be relevant to your firms. And then what we're going to do is then pivot on to, as you say, how if this resonates with you and you the burden of keeping these things up to date resonates with you, we can show you the art of the possible, what technology can do to help you with this on that journey. So really, what I wanted to do, Michael, is, we've talked about challenges of keeping HR policies compliant. Maybe holistically, could you give people an understanding of some of the key issues and some of the key things that people need to be aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. I think sort of the challenge that employers face implementing and maintaining HR policies are manyfold. So first and foremost, you have to identify where do you have employees working. So I think a lot of employers mistakenly believe that they just need to comply with the state laws where they're headquartered. But that is clearly not the case, right? As an employer, you have to comply with federal law, which of course applies nationwide, but you also have to comply with the law where each employee is physically located. So if you're headquartered in Nebraska, you got to comply with federal law, Nebraska law. But if you have employees working in Iowa or Illinois, you have to make sure that you have the relevant policies in those states as well. And as you can imagine, I think as you alluded to, COVID is really something that dramatically changed this for employers. And I look at my own company. For our company, we're based in the Washington, D.C. area, actually headquartered right outside of Washington, D.C. in Virginia. So before COVID, the vast majority of our employees were simply working at our headquarters in Virginia. But when COVID hit, everyone went remote. Frankly, we had a lot of people move And we decided to move to a remote workforce, and now we hire people from all over the country. So now we have employees working in more than a dozen states. So that creates a tremendous challenge for us because we have to identify where are all those employees located and what laws might apply, and therefore what changes might be required to those policies. So for example, we had a couple of employees move to California. California, depending on your size of your organization, there are, I believe it's 23 specific policies that you may have to have, which, is much more than many other states. So first you have to identify where do you have employees. And so like when we work with clients, we first identify, we have them send us a list. Okay, these are the states where they have employees, and these are the number of employees that are in each state, because some of the laws only apply if you have a certain number of employees generally, or if you have a certain number of employees in that particular location. So we figure out where you have employees. And of course, if you're doing it yourself, this is the same thing that you do. So figure out where you have employees, the number of employees you have. Identify what are the required policies in those jurisdictions. Draft those policies, ensuring that you meet that the language meets the requirements of each specific law. So at that point, hopefully you've got all the required policies. Now, actually, the real challenge begins, because oftentimes what happens is you spend a lot of time and effort drafting these policies, maybe putting them within an employee handbook, but then a month later it's out of date, right? Because a new state has passed a new law. So you have to set up a system to make sure you're monitoring legal changes in all states where you have employees. Once you identify the change, then go in, make that change to the policy. And then at times the change may be significant that you're going to need to provide that policy again to your employees and have them acknowledge that policy. And of course, sort of a best practice is to provide the policies to the handbook to employees on an annual basis and have them acknowledge it. So that's the overall challenge of the process of creating policies and keeping them up to date.
So I think we've got, if we move on quickly to our sort of first poll questions, Brianna, if in the background you could, thank you very much, put the poll question up. So really the question is, when did you last audit your HR policies? As Michael has said, it's interesting, to the existing policies, but also the policies that new policies you may need with people who are, as we have new jurisdictions. So the answers are A, 1 year ago, B, 2 years ago, C, more than 2 years ago, and D, we continue to update. And I think we've got pretty much most people have answered. If I end the poll, before I do, because I think the majority are in a good place, actually, insofar as they are continually updating as laws change. Michael, that's probably good. We've got 8% sitting in at more than 2 years ago, 23% at 1 year ago, 15% 2 years ago. So I don't know whether that's representative, Michael, of what you'd expect to see. Over just over half are continuing monitoring. I said say 40% either 1 or 2 years ago, and unfortunately 8% more than 2 years ago.
That's sort of interesting breakdown. The challenge is really everyone needs to be with that 54%, right? But yeah, so basically that's sort of, I think that's reflective of kind of what we see generally. Typically a larger organization that perhaps has an employment lawyer on staff whose only job is to focus on policies, they're able to monitor the law in all the different states and then continually update those laws, continually update those policies. So that's good to see that.
Okay, and there is actually just sort of related, there's one question in from someone. Do you provide a labour law posting service for remote employees?
Yeah, so we actually provide, we provide the links to the posters for each state that you can provide to remote employees. It's an interesting thing. So that the Department of Labor has actually issued guidance on this issue. So as you probably know, if you have a physical location, you have to have physical posters. And we have a partnership with the labor law posting company that provides those physical posters. It's not enough just to provide electronic versions of the posters if you have a physical location. That said, even if you have a physical location, but you have, say, remote employees that really never come into the office, you should provide them those postings and those notices electronically. And yes, we do provide that service.
Fantastic. Okay, so I guess moving on to some of the more specifics then. I think the first time we met, we at Interact, I think you did a very interesting talk on some of the sexual harassment laws and harassment. So maybe could you maybe share, as you say, some of the examples of those HR policies that at the federal state level and some of the recent updates as well?
Yeah, because I think one of the things that we see is that, so frankly, a lot of employers, they're not on top of keeping the policies up to date or ensuring that the policies as drafted include all the required content. And so one example of this are sexual harassment policies. So sexual harassment and then broader EEO policies. So EEO being equal employment opportunities, policies around discrimination generally. So since 1998, like the US Supreme Court has made clear, every employer in America has to have a harassment policy and really should provide training to all employees on harassment prevention. And then the EEOC, the federal agency responsible for harassment and discrimination investigations, they have issued guidance on what that policy should include. So you should review the EEOC guidance and check it against your policy to make sure you're including all the required elements. Because if you get sued for harassment, the plaintiff's attorney or the EEOC attorney or the Department of Justice attorney, like where I used to work, in that lawsuit, they're going to be looking at your policy and seeing, do you have all the recommended elements from the EEOC? Now, what's even more of a challenge is that really in the past 4 or 5 years since the Me Too movement hit, several states have passed laws that require very specific content be included in your sexual harassment policy. So there are 11 states that have very specific requirements. And the challenge is those requirements vary by state. So for example, in New York State, you have to have your sexual harassment policy has to include a very specific complaint form. In California, like there's other content requirements. So once again, you got to look at where do you have employees? Are there any specific content requirements in those states? And make sure your policy includes all the required content. And it gets even more challenging because some cities, such as New York City and most recently Chicago, have also passed statutes that require very specific content. If you have any employee in the city of Chicago, right, even if they're just working from home, you have to ensure that you have a policy that meets the federal requirements. Also, you're probably going to want to have an Illinois supplement to that policy. That's going to, because Illinois is one of the states that requires very specific content. And then in Chicago, you're going to need a Chicago supplement as well. So for example, under the Chicago law, that policy must include what is the definition of sexual harassment in the city of Chicago, which is much broader than the definition of sexual harassment nationwide. Also, in that policy must include details on how employees can contact the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, can contact the Illinois Department of Human Rights, or can contact the relevant local agency in Chicago. In New York State, and so basically the Chicago law, I just want to make sure you're aware of this because this is brand new. The law was enacted in April, and then it went into effect very shortly thereafter. It went into effect on July 1. So you need to make sure that you're looking at that. Also in the state of New York, just in the last couple of months, New York State changed their law that's going to require a change to your harassment policy where you have to provide employees information on the fact that New York now has a hotline that employees can call if they want to get legal advice or guidance around sexual harassment issues in the workplace. And just another one I'll throw out there because I think it's really interesting is Washington, D.C. Here where we're very close to at Clear Law Institute. Washington, D.C. just passed a sexual harassment law that only applies to employers that have tipped employees in D.C. But if you have a single tipped employee, then you must make sure your policy meets all the required elements of the D.C. law. And you got to provide training to your employees. And interestingly, you have to provide a copy of your policy to the DC Office of Human Rights. So when we think of tipped employees, obviously we're thinking about restaurants or hotels, or if you have a coffee chain where people, anywhere where any employee can, where a customer can leave a tip, Now this law applies to you. So these are just some examples of newer sexual harassment laws. The other thing I would say is one of the big areas that we see changes is around protected characteristics. So harassment and discrimination laws, of course, apply not just to sex, but they apply to race, religion, national origin, gender identity, etc. Well, states and localities are continually expanding that list of protected characteristics. So just in the past couple of years, 18 states have passed laws that are called the Crown Act. And these laws prohibit discrimination based on hairstyles to the extent that hairstyles relate to race. So if you're in one of these 18 states, you need to make sure you've updated your policy to specifically incorporate that in the policy. California, just in the last few weeks, added a new protected characteristic, which is the use of cannabis off duty. So beginning January 1, 2024, you as an employer are not allowed to discriminate or harass an employee because they use cannabis off duty. So that's just an example of a policy update that you'll need to make in California.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michael. There's interesting because where we go next to on sort of types of leave law, I know is a good topic for yourself. We've actually had a question in on that. It's a hot topic. I don't know if you can see it. It says that the company I work for is in Texas. I'm the only remote employee. I live in Washington State, so near you, obviously. Texas does not require paid sick leave. However, because Washington State does require 1 hour earned for every 40 hours worked, being as I live and work out of state, do I go by Texas law or Washington State law?
Yeah, so one, Henry, it's interesting. It's a UK guy's knowledge of the US. So Washington State's actually far from Washington, D.C. But I will grant you, my geography of the UK is absolutely terrible. So I'm just impressed you knew that it was a state. So yeah, so for that employee, that's a great example. So the company's headquartered in Texas, but that particular employee is located in Washington State. So Washington State law is going to apply. Now, as I say, sometimes these laws, particularly around paid family medical leave, they only apply if you have a certain number of employees. And once again, that varies by state. Oftentimes, though, the number of employee requirement is based on the number of employees you have anywhere. So whether they're in Washington State, Texas, Illinois, Mexico, Canada, UK, if you have a certain number of employees, you're covered even if you only have one employee in that particular state. But that does vary a bit by state. So that's obviously when we create policies for organizations, that's why it's so important that we know not just where they have employees, but the number of employees they have in each state.
Cool. And I mean, based on the other sort of types of leave law, is there any other sort of things you'd like to call out?
Yeah, and actually, and I just even going back to the last slide, just to briefly mention just a few other topics that I talked about, sexual harassment EO laws, but another big topic is around accommodations, and that goes into a few different buckets. So one, Connecticut just passed a law requiring lactation accommodation, meaning that an employer that has a physical location in Connecticut, they have to provide a room for mothers to express breast milk. Also, there are many states, I think it's probably about a dozen now, that have pregnancy accommodation policies. So you need to include that in your policy, but also there's notice requirements. So for many of the states, on the when an employee is hired, you have to give them this notice that if they become pregnant, you're going to work with them to try to accommodate the pregnancy. And within 10 days of a woman telling you that she is pregnant, you have to give them that notice again. So these are like nuances where it's just easy for employers to be tripped up because they just are not aware of all the nuances of the law. Wage and hour is a huge area where there's actually more class action wage and hour lawsuits than almost all other class action lawsuits combined, because this area of law is very complex and it varies so much by state. It's very easy for employers to violate it, right? So nationwide, if you are an employee that's entitled to overtime, then your employer has to pay you at time and a half for more than 40 hours in a week. But in some states, like in California, You have to be paid for time and a half if you work more than 8 hours in a day, even if you work less than 40 hours in that particular week. Meal and rest breaks is a huge area of litigation. There are now more than 20 states that put forth very specific requirements that if an employee is working, like Illinois just passed a law just recently, that if an employee works more than 7.5 hours in a day, you must give them a meal break that must be at least 20 minutes in length, and the break has to start no more than 5.5 hours after their shift. So it's just very complex. So it just shows kind of some of the nuances around these laws.
So it sounds like a minefield, Michael, and as I say, difficult to keep top of. Yeah, sorry for jumping ahead. I got carried away with the question. So, say the other area, as you said, are those the different types of leave law? You say wage and hours naturally leads into this as well, and another minefield for people to navigate.
Yeah, this is the really big challenge, right? In the sense that this is an area where, for whatever reason, like states and localities have been very active. So a lot of people are familiar with the Family and Medical Leave Act that applies nationwide. Now, it only applies if you have 50 employees or more within a 75-mile radius. So it's interesting in that regard. So not all employers are covered by the Family and Medical Leave, but if you are covered, it means that you have to give employees up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave each year to deal with certain conditions, such as the birth, adoption, foster placement of a child. If you're dealing with a serious health condition, or if you're caring for the serious health condition of a spouse, a child, or a parent. So that's the core, and there's a few other nuances, but that's the core of that law. And that leave is unpaid. But what's happened is about, I think it's like now 10, or maybe it's 10 or 11, like 10 or 11 states have enacted paid family medical leave. But they, as you can imagine, once again, it varies dramatically by state on which employers are covered, how long do you have to work for the employer to be entitled to it? Who pays for this? Does the employer pay a premium? Does that come out of the employee's paycheck? Does the state fund it? So there's all these different nuances that you have to be aware of. Similarly, outside of just paid family medical leave, there's lots of laws around like vacation and sick leave. So at the national level, there's not really a requirement for you to even provide sick leave or vacation leave to your employees, but some states require that. Similarly, a lot of states have requirements that you must allow employees to take time off to vote or volunteer as an election official, but it varies by state on how long that must be. Is it 2 hours on election day? Is it 4 hours? There's a lot of leave requirements around the criminal justice system, like if someone's a victim of domestic violence, or they're otherwise a victim of a crime, or they witnessed to a crime, or they've been asked to serve on a jury. In certain jurisdictions, like there are certain requirements that you must give them leave and the parameters around that. There's some new laws around bereavement leave, and this typically applies if an employee has, let's say, has a miscarriage, or their spouse has a miscarriage, or there's a death of a newborn infant. Then there's like certain rules around that you must give that employee. I think in Washington State, for example, you got to give them the next 7 calendar days off. In Illinois, it's the next 10 days. Similar laws around parental leave, and then just a whole variety of other types of leave. I've just put them on the screen here, like organ, bone marrow, blood donors. In some states, you got to give people leave just to attend their kids' school activities. Some states have military leave if they get caught up to the armed forces. Now, there's a federal law on that, but some states have gone beyond that. And then in some states, if an employee, like this actually comes up in the West quite a bit, like in California, Oregon, and Washington, like if there's forest fires and you have an employee and they are like in a volunteer fire department and they need to go and help fight that fire, you as an employer must allow them to use their sick leave, for example, to do that. So just a whole lot of nuance around this. So this is the complexity of keeping up with all these different laws.
Thank you, Michael, for that background. I guess that brings us to our second poll question. And I guess, again, the crux of, I guess, as Michael has described, the minefield and the complexity there is in HR law and others is really, how do each of your organizations currently maintain your policies, attestate people's user attestation for that, and reporting? The answer being A, currently running some form of policy management program on an automated system, mainly using spreadsheets, documents, emails, none of the above, or don't know. I guess before we come to as people are voting, what's your view, Michael? What do you see in the marketplace? What would you expect the answers to be?
I just think, yes, I'm not sure as far as what people are actually doing. I know this is a huge challenge for a lot of our clients, because with the policy, particularly like the policy creation process, particularly if they're doing it themselves rather than like outsourcing like to a group like us, if they're doing it themselves, it's just very challenging because there's so many different stakeholders involved, right? Typically it's owned by HR, but obviously legal needs to be involved to make sure that it's compliant in all the jurisdictions. There may also just be operational policies that might impact things. So it can be a real challenge getting everybody on the same page on, okay, this is the right policy and we're all in agreement with this language. Oh yeah, and that language is compliant with the law in these various states.
Yeah, I think I'm just sharing the results now. It does look like there's a small percentage, 15%, that do have automation, which I guess is good. I'm not surprised that the majority, 60%, are using manual processes, which hopefully will come on to describe how, if you are experiencing some of the issues that we're about to discuss, how technology can help. And there's a few people who don't know, or none of the above. So I guess I think that would be representative. Over 50% still in that sort of manual world, and trying to deal with, as you say, the maintenance of those policies, but also ensuring that the correct people have signed off, and keeping and making sure that they are distributed to the correct people. So I guess, this, as Michael teed up very nicely, it's a very dynamic world, certainly in the HR space, and more widely for all of the policies that we have. I think the world that Michael described, that's always there. There are multiple states that they're going to be changing all of these types of laws that if we work in those jurisdictions. I think, as mentioned earlier, with the onset of COVID and the different ways that we now work, that has increased the complexity, that's increased the need to ensure that we keep those policies up to date. And depending on the industry that you work in, some of those compliance pressures, regulatory pressures, ensuring that we keeping those policies updated and are communicated to our employees is a regulatory requirement. And if we fall foul of that doesn't help. That can be very detrimental to our organization. So I guess what the sort of key issues that we see is trying to have a central place where all of those policies are stored and all of the relevant people are kept up to date. The three cornerstones, that is, and also the ability to communicate and making sure that we understand that attestation, and making sure there is always a central store where people can go to get those latest policies. So those three things, the maintenance of those policies by the right people, that communication, attestation, and that central store is the cornerstone of any good sort of policy management solution, and something that most of, say, over 50% of the organizations represented here are trying to do, obviously manually using SharePoint, Excel, and everything. I guess one of the things that for those people not in the 15% that have solved this, just to give you an understanding of what technology can do to help support you in this area. If you're starting on the right hand side, so the development and review of policies. So effectively, as Michael said, is as we either develop new policies because we've gone into a new state, or as laws are changing within those states, we will have, and Michael described earlier, the the fact that we will have different stakeholders within the organization, whether it's HR, whether it's legal, whether it's compliance, that will need to be reviewing those policies. So their role is to keep that, to ensure that policy is up to date, other people to ensure that has been updated correctly. So that whole creation, editing, updating, that whole workflow within our solution, we allow that collaboration and ensure that depending on the policy, that those changes are made and agreed to and authorized by the correct people. Now, clearly, we've talked about changes that occur, but also typically we have to review policies on an annual basis, whether there's been a change or not. So again, you want to ensure that the workflow, whether I kick something off because I know there's been a law change, or whether I have an annual review of my policies to ensure they're up to date, all of those need to be done by the relevant people. And then ideally, if anybody comes, and as Michael will come on to the audit of that process, if you do get sued in one of the areas that Michael talked about, the ability for us to show that we developed that policy correctly and was signed off is key to that. But more importantly, not just the development, is then as we move around to the publishing and attestation, is once we've updated those policies, we need to get those out to the relevant stakeholders as fast as possible. So we need to be getting those policies in front of the relevant people. We want to ensure we have a timescale under which we want attestation that people have seen those policies, have reviewed them, signed off on those policies, acknowledged those changes. You may not just want to do that. The last piece in that is the knowledge assessment. So as part of the acknowledgement, the potential change that's occurred in that policy, what we're able to do is test the understanding of our employees of that policy or the changes to that policy. So all part of that getting the attestation of that policy and that knowledge assessment is key to us as an organization, ensuring that we know that our employees have been provided with the latest HR policy or any other policy, that they understand it and they've attested to that. I guess as a side note, we do have one customer who, during COVID, one of the policies that I think got changed the most was the return to work policy. We had one client who linked the attestation of the return to work policy to their door access system. So you could not get back into the building until you'd signed off the latest return to work policy. So that's an end, allowing you that end to ensure that this is bringing that sort of policy management to life and making it really practical, but also, as Michael described, ensuring that we have updated, we've got the relevant updates in, we've got those out to the relevant employees, and we've got their attestation. And importantly, because this is all in a system, what you're able to then do is, if you're sitting in HR and suddenly the CEO comes in and says the latest HR policy, sent it out to everybody, has everybody got it and has everybody acknowledged it? If you don't have a system, that's going to be hard to trawl through emails. Yes, I sent all those emails out. I've checked that all the latest employees have got it. We've checked that we've got an acknowledgement because it's an important policy. The changes in sexual harassment in a certain state is important. We want to make sure that's gone. But also the fact that in publishing these things, one thing I missed out on is we can also target things relevantly. So as Michael said, we will have employees in different states and therefore different policies will apply to different people. Rather than sending the same policy to everybody, we're able to distinguish that. So if there's an update in the Californian law, we can send the HR policy for California just to those people or update them or the people who are affected by that. So we have an ability to target people. We have an ability to then report on and ensure that those people that are relevant have received the most up-to-date document and we're able to ensure that we're comfortable that they have received the most up-to-date policy. And also when they want to review a policy, they're not looking at one that we may have sent them 2 years ago, they forgot to delete, and they're looking at that. They can only see within the solution the latest policy. So that's the cornerstone of what policy management can do. So as I say, to the 60 or the 85% that don't have an automation, these are the types of things that if some of those issues are resonating, this is how technology can help you maintain those policies and ensuring that they're published to the right people. You don't just have a shared drive with all our policies. We update them we just expect employees to go in and see them. No, we can make sure they're targeted, they're sent to the right people, that when they're updated, those are updated. And if, as an organization, if I have, say, 200 policies, but actually Michael is living in Washington, is only 10 of them are relevant to him, when he goes into the solution, he only sees the 10, not the 200, because they're tailored to where he is in the within the country.
And Henry, I can imagine like one of the big, from a legal perspective, like one of the powerful aspects of a policy management software system is for new employees, because this is an area where a lot of employers are violating the law without knowing it. And frankly, they don't learn it until they get a lawsuit. And because what happens, like in certain jurisdictions, and we'll just take like sexual harassment policies as an example. For example, like in New York State, at the time of hire, as soon as you hire that employee, you have to provide them a copy of your sexual harassment policy. And you have to do that for every employee. And so if there's litigation arises, how do we now go back and figure out the start date for every employee? And is there some electronic record, or there may be someone handling the document? And then in other jurisdictions, it's like within the first week of hire, or there's all these different requirements. So that is a really important aspect, just to have that electronic tracking system. We also saw that during COVID, by the way. During COVID, we worked with a lot of employers to create COVID prevention plans. Written plans were required in several jurisdictions like California, like New York, like Virginia. And there were requirements around just making sure that not only do you have a policy, but the employees actually, they get a hold of the policy and they have the opportunity to read it and understand it.
Yeah. So as we like to say, we drink our own champagne. To your point about new employees, Policy Hub, as a new employee in California in sales, I will automatically be added to through Active Directory integration. I know the department I'm in, and therefore automatically mapped are the relevant policies are actually the first three or four emails are from Policy Hub to tell you exactly the policies that are relevant to you and asking me to attest to them in a period of time. And there are escalations if you don't. So all of those things are just automated. What do we do when we have a new employee? We create them an Active Directory account. We create them a user ID. That, when integrated to your policy management system, will automatically kick off those policy procedures. There's nothing someone in HR needs to do because it's set up automatically. And me, if I go into our portal, I will just see the latest policies that I signed off on maybe 6-9 months ago, but I can't remember. I can see the ones that are relevant to myself. And that's the important. And to your other point is, it's audited. You can see exactly when I receive them. You can see exactly when I acknowledge them. I guess coming on to the sources of value in terms of being able to have that. The top one, I think you talked to very eloquently, which is the regulatory non-compliance, those incidents. If I am facing a sexual harassment case against one of our employees, it is, as you've described, it's important to show that we created the policies accurate to the law within that state. They were distributed to everybody. So we did as much as we could, including potentially even, as I say, that knowledge assessment, so they understood the policy. So we as an organization did what we legally were required to do to be able to ensure our employees were aware of their obligations. And therefore, as an organization, we did as much as we could do. The resulting of doing that is obviously it prevents the litigation costs, but also it protects our brand. We have shown and we can demonstrate that we take these things seriously, that we have robust processes to be able to educate our employees on their responsibilities. So a huge source of value in being able to be able to very quickly and robustly defend ourselves against any form of litigation we have. From a resilience perspective, again, we've talked quite a lot about the flexibility. There's a lot of changes in laws, as you said, Michael. We have standard things like mergers and acquisitions come along. We're going to have more people come into the organization. We may have different things different ways that we're going to be working. New operations that require different policies. As we say, jurisdictions will bring new policies in, but also then we have things like COVID that come along. And that ability to be dynamic, agile, flexible, and be precise in the way we do that is made a lot easier if you do have some of that automation. The last two, in terms of cost reduction and efficiency, the whole, as I say, we talked about, I guess, in links very closely to the litigation, so reducing the costs in terms of compliance. things are, can we be sure that everybody in California has been made aware of the latest sexual harassment laws that have been passed? But also, it's not just of that, but it's also the efficiency of ensuring that we're keeping our policies up to date. The right people have signed off on it, and that whole end-to-end process is made a lot easier if we do it in an organized fashion. So depending on which lens you look through, from an efficiency perspective, you're not running around chasing your tail trying to make sure that we have sent it out to the 500 employees we've got on California. Have they all responded? Did we actually send them the right document that was signed off by everybody? So there's a whole piece here that just makes ourselves far more robust to meet a lot of the challenges that Michael talked about up front. Was there anything else you wanted to mention here, Mike, before we go to one final poll question, and we still have a few questions to answer, actually?
No, I think this is great. I think you can go to the poll question.
Cool. So the last poll question really here was, based on what you've learned today, and I say we'll leave this poll question up. Would you like to know more about ClearLaw's HR policy and employment handbook service, more about Mitratech's Policy Hub solution, hopefully both A and B, or neither? Thank you very much. Just quickly going to the questions while we leave that poll question up there. I've got one here. Where do we get the electronic posters for remote workers? I think that's one for you, Michael.
Yeah, so I mean for example, that's a service that we provide. So obviously that's a paid service. So basically what we're doing is we're looking at every state and collecting we're looking at all the different requirements and collecting like the posting requirements. So that's a service we offer, and there's other companies that offer that as well. And you can do it yourself. It's just a matter of generally what you need to do is you need to go to the federal posters, and by the way, on that, the EEOC just in the last month just came out with their new poster. It's called it used to be called EO is the law. And they just came out with a brand new poster. So you need to make sure that you update your postings, both remotely and physically with that new posting. So you need to look at the federal level at the EOC, but also like the Department of Labor, OSHA. There's various agencies that have posting requirements. At the state level, most states have state law equivalents to the EOC. So they're like in California, they just changed the name to now it's called California Civil Rights Commission. In Illinois, it's the Illinois Department of Human Rights. So you need to go to the relevant agency, both for discrimination law, there's probably like an OSHA equivalent in many states. So there's just that's where, if you were doing it yourself, where you would find it. But obviously, that's the service we provide. So we're obviously happy to talk to you about that.
Another question, I think, for you, Michael. So many employees want to work through their lunch break so as to shorten their end time. How do you navigate this as an employer?
Really challenging, right? So there's a couple of big issues here. So first off, you have, and this is why I say why there's so many class action lawsuits around wage and hour and meal breaks. Almost every employer in America is violating this law because the law varies so much state to state, and a lot of times it's not intuitive what the law should be. So one, for example, let's say you have an administrative assistant who works normally from 9 to 5:30 with a 30-minute lunch break from 12 to 12:30. So they're working 8 hours in a day. So one, if they just go out and pick up lunch and they come back and they're just surfing the internet while they're eating lunch during that 30-minute period, they don't have to be paid for that time. But if the phone occasionally rings, and if it rings, if they pick up the phone and they transfer it to you, they must be paid for that entire time. So that's like a nuance that most organizations aren't aware of. And frankly, they don't become aware of it until maybe they lay off an employee or a group of employees goes to a plaintiff's attorney and there's a class action lawsuit. Now, so that's one area. The separate issue here is around these meal and rest break laws, where you as an employer must give them, as I said, like in Illinois recently, you got to give them a 20-minute break. And I think it varies by state, like whether you could just require them to take that break, but you at least have to give them that option. But let's see, the challenge though is that because you have to give them that option, if they do choose to work, they got to be paid for that time. So this is why it gets so complex. And why it's important to have the right policies and have them communicated out to each employee.
Oh, fantastic. I've got one more here. Who owns or should own the policy management framework or policy management tool? Don't know if you want to have a go at that and then I can follow.
Yeah, in most organizations we work with, it really depends on the policies. So the HR, employment law policies that tend to be owned by HR, though with significant support, either from an organization like us, or if they have an internal employment law council that has the time to keep these things up to date. On the compliance end, policies around code of conduct, anti-corruption, insider trading, money laundering, that's typically owned by the compliance department. Once again, also with support from legal.
Yeah, I think most, if I look at sort of the enterprise level, it's definitely the overarching is in the compliance department, as you say, very or controlled, very or normally coming under the general counsel to make sure that there is legal sign off there. But as you say, from an HR perspective, and I think as you described very eloquently in the HR space, the whole thing about compliance from a policy perspective, you need the expertise of individuals in HR, in legal, in risk, to ensure that we get those experts there to maintain those policies. And clearly, if you do have a system in place, there will be potentially, unless you have a hosted solution, SaaS solution, maybe some requirement from IT to support. But I think from a framework and policy perspective, it is. Yeah, it's those compliance team. I think we've got time for one last question. And I think maybe this is probably a good way of wrapping up because whilst you've talked eloquently, what are some of the biggest challenges in keeping policies up to date with legal changes? I guess that's you've done a lot of that, but
yeah,
whether you can maybe summarize what you said today.
I think that there's a fundamental decision an employer has to make if they're operating in many states or many jurisdictions and localities. So one is, do they want to have a handbook with all the policies that's going to be basically that they're giving all employees nationwide like the most generous benefits? Now, so if you do that, then you will just have a single handbook, but you've got to make sure that if California extends voting leave law from 4 hours to 8 hours, now you got to do that nationwide. Most employers don't want to do that. They want to give what they think is reasonable nationwide. But then what that means, and this is what we provide, is making sure they have the appropriate state supplements. So if you're looking at taking leave to go vote, then okay, at our organization, we give up to 2 hours of unpaid leave. But if you're in this state, click here. Okay, I'm in California. Okay, now actually I'm entitled to 4 hours. So basically making that decision about, are we going to give all employees like the most generous benefit, which I think is unusual, multi-state employers for most. But if not, do we have the state supplements and do we have a process in place for monitoring the law and keeping those supplements up to date?
Fantastic.
A lot of the main handbooks are, though that's not as difficult generally to keep up to date, but it's at the state and even the local levels is where you see a lot of non-compliance.
Well, brilliant, Michael. I think that seems to have flown. I can't believe that's been an hour. It's flown past. Thank you very much indeed for your insight. For those still on the call, we will share a copy of the recording and some more information on ClearLaw and Mitratech's Policy Hub solution. I hope everybody enjoyed today's call. Thank you very much indeed for your time and look forward to seeing you on another webinar or helping you with any issues that you may have in this area. But Michael, thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, thank you, Henry.